If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Michael O'Brien, and I need to tell you about what happened in the Boundary Waters last winter. The kind of thing that makes you question everything you believe in. I've been a ranger here for 12 years, after leaving my job as a sheriff down in Minneapolis. I thought I'd seen it all: bear attacks, lost hikers, deadly storms, but nothing could have prepared me for this. It all started when we hit record-breaking cold. I mean, Minnesota winters are always harsh, but this was different. The thermometer at my station hadn't climbed above -42.4 for 2 straight weeks. The kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth, that makes trees explode from the ice in their trunks. I remember that morning clearly. I was sipping my coffee, trying to warm up my hands around the mug, when the radio crackled. Station 7, our northernmost outpost, had gone silent. No morning check-in, no response to calls, nothing but static. Usually, this meant a power outage or equipment failure, but something felt wrong. My gut was screaming at me, and in my 20 years of law enforcement, I'd learned to trust that feeling. Before I could head out, Joe Running Bear, one of the local Ojibwe elders, showed up at my door. I'd known Joe for years, a quiet man, respected in the community. But that day, his face was different, scared. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said, "Michael, you mustn't go alone. The hunger spirit is awake." I'd heard whispers about these spirits before, especially the Wendigo, an ancient creature born from human greed and hunger. I'd always filed them away as campfire stories, but the look in Joe's eyes made my skin crawl. 3 winters like this, he said, his voice shaking. 3 winters of unnatural cold in the past 100 years. Each time people disappeared. Each time we found what was left of them. He pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch filled with herbs. "For protection," he said. I should have listened more carefully to Joe that day, should have taken more precautions, because what I found at Station 7 would haunt me for the rest of my life. 3 rangers were missing, good people, experienced outdoors folks. And on the trees around the station, carved deep into the bark with what looked like human fingernails, were symbols I'd never seen before. The wind was picking up as I parked my truck, howling through the trees like a wounded animal. Or maybe, looking back now, it wasn't the wind at all. Maybe it was something else, something hungry, watching me from the endless white of the forest. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have turned around, called for backup, done anything but walk into that station alone. But I didn't know. How could I? How could anyone have guessed that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would test not just my courage, but my very humanity? The radio in my truck crackled one last time before dying completely, and I stepped out into the bitter cold, my boots crunching in snow that seemed just a little too red in places. And that's when I heard it, a voice that sounded exactly like my daughter Sarah, calling for help from somewhere in the trees. But Sarah was hundreds of miles away at college. At least, that's what I thought. I grabbed my flashlight and emergency pack, trying to ignore that voice that sounded like Sarah. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The snow was deep, coming up to my knees in some places, and the wind kept getting stronger. It was only 3 p.m., but the sky looked like night was coming early. The first thing I noticed when I got closer to Station 7 was the silence. No generator hum, no radio static, not even birds. Just that howling wind. The station door was open, swinging back and forth, banging against the wall. That's not something rangers would do, not in this weather. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast whiteness. "This is Ranger O'Brien. Anyone here?" No answer. Just that terrible silence. My flashlight beam showed me things I wish I hadn't seen. The inside of the station was a mess, chairs overturned, papers everywhere. But what made my blood run cold was the half-eaten food on the table. not normal food. Raw meat, torn apart by hands, not cutlery. And dark stains on the floor that looked too much like blood. In the corner, a video camera was still running, its red light blinking steadily. With trembling fingers, I rewound the tape and pressed play. The screen showed Mark, one of the missing rangers, recording a log entry. He looked terrible, pale, sweating despite the cold, his eyes wild. Day 15 of the cold snap, his voice cracked. Something's wrong. We're all so hungry. The food. It doesn't help anymore. Nothing helps. And the dreams. God, the dreams. They're getting worse. Last night I saw Tom eating. No, I can't say it. There's something out there in the snow. It calls to us, makes us want things. Terrible things. The video jumped, showing snippets of the next few days. Each one worse than the last. The Rangers growing thinner, more desperate. Arguing over food. Their eyes changing, becoming less human. Then I heard it again. Sarah's voice, closer this time. Dad! Dad! Help me, I'm so cold! My heart was pounding. I knew it couldn't be her, but it sounded so real. And underneath her voice, I heard something else. A sound like ice cracking, like bones breaking. That's when the radio suddenly came to life, spitting out static and broken words. Through the noise, I heard Tom's voice, one of the missing Rangers. Michael. Run. It's not what you think. We're not anymore. The lights in the station flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I saw something move outside the window. Something tall, something that shouldn't exist. And it was smiling at me with too many teeth. I had to make a choice. Stay in the station with whatever was out there watching me, or try to make it back to my truck. But before I could decide, I heard heavy footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps that no human could make. And they were moving toward the door. I grabbed my radio and backed into the corner, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped right above me. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would burst. Then I heard it, a sound like someone dragging their nails across the metal roof, slow and scratching. Think, Michael, think, I whispered to myself. The safety of my truck was just 50 yards away, but those were going to be the longest 50 yards of my life. That's when my radio crackled again. This time, it was Lisa's voice, another missing ranger. But something was wrong with it. It sounded wet, like she was talking with her mouth full. Michael, so hungry, join us. A loud thump shook the whole station. Whatever was on the roof had jumped down. I could see its shadow through the frosted window, tall. So tall it had to bend down to look inside. I remembered Joe's leather pouch and pulled it out with shaking hands. The herbs inside smelled strong and earthy. He said it was for protection. Well, I needed all the protection I could get right now. Just then, my flashlight caught something under the desk, a journal. I grabbed it quickly and stuffed it in my jacket. Maybe it had answers about what happened here. The creature outside started walking around the station. Each step made a crunching sound in the snow. But it wasn't normal footsteps. It sounded like someone walking on broken bones. I had to make a run for it. The truck was my only chance. I took a deep breath and gripped the small pouch tight. 1, 2. I counted in my head. Before I could reach 3, the station door flew open. Cold air rushed in, and with it came a smell, like rotten meat left in the sun. I dove behind a filing cabinet just in time. What walked in wasn't human anymore. It might have been Tom once, but now it was something else. His body was stretched too tall, skin pale as the snow outside. His fingers had grown into long claws, and his mouth. His mouth was full of sharp, jagged teeth. He was sniffing the air, turning his head in jerky movements. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look behind the cabinet. Michal, he said in a voice that sounded like breaking ice. We're so hungry. The hunger never stops. Join us, or become food. I looked at the door. It was still open. If I could just... Then my radio betrayed me. It let out a burst of static, and Tom's head snapped toward my hiding spot. Our eyes met, and I saw nothing human left in his, just endless, hungry darkness. I had seconds to act, but what happened next would change everything. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw Joe's leather pouch straight at Tom's face. The herbs burst out, filling the air with a strong smell. Tom let out a horrible scream and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes. That was my chance. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The cold hit me like a punch to the face. The snow was deeper now, making each step harder. Behind me, I heard Tom's screams turn into something angry, something hungry. "Michael," his voice echoed through the trees. "You can't escape the hunger." I was halfway to my truck when I saw them, two more figures emerging from the forest. They moved in a strange way, like broken puppets. In the fading light, I recognized Lisa and Mark, but like Tom, they weren't human anymore. Their bodies were twisted, their fingers too long, their mouths too wide. My truck was still 30 yards away. They were closing in from 3 directions. Then I heard Sarah's voice again, this time from right behind me. "Dad, why are you running? I'm right here." "Don't turn around," I told myself. "It's not real. It's not her." The snow was getting deeper, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. Each breath burned in my lungs. 20 yards to go. Lisa jumped forward with impossible speed. Her claws missed my face by inches. I stumbled, but kept running. 15 yards. Mark appeared on my right, moving like a spider, his body bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. 10 yards. My fingers found my keys in my pocket. The truck was so close now. 5 yards. Something grabbed my jacket from behind. I slipped out of it, leaving it in their grasp. The journal fell into the snow, but there was no time to grab it. I reached my truck, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in. "Come on, come on!" I turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice. They were all around the truck now. Tom's face appeared at my window, those terrible teeth scraping against the glass. Mark was on the hood, his claws leaving deep scratches in the metal. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, then drive, not caring what I hit. The tires spun in the snow before finding grip. I saw them in my rearview mirror, standing in the road, watching me drive away. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because as I drove, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized 3 things. First, I was still hearing Sarah's voice, getting clearer. Second, my arm was bleeding where Lisa's claws had scratched me. And third, I was starting to feel very, very hungry. I drove straight to Joe's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The scratch on my arm was burning, and my stomach felt like it was trying to eat itself. I'd never felt hunger like this before. Joe was waiting on his porch, like he knew I'd be coming. One look at my face, and he rushed me inside. "You've seen them," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you're scratched. We don't have much time." His small house smelled of sage and wood smoke. Joe sat me down and looked at my arm. The scratch was turning black around the edges, and my skin felt ice cold. "The Wendigo's hunger spreads through blood and bite," Joe explained while cleaning my wound. "It changes you slowly at first, then all at once. But there might be a way to stop it." My stomach cramped again, worse this time. "How long?" I managed to ask. 2 days, maybe 3, before the change takes you completely. Joe's voice was grim. "But there's something else you need to know. Your daughter called the station while you were gone. She's driving up here to surprise you." My blood turned to ice. "What? No, she can't come here. She's already on her way, and the Wendigo, it knows. That's why you keep hearing her voice. It's trying to lure you both." I tried to stand up, but the room spun. "I have to stop her, have to warn her." "You can barely walk," Joe said, pushing me back down. "Listen carefully. There's an old ritual that can bind the Wendigo for another 50 years, but it requires a sacrifice, someone willing to give their life to save others. The hunger was getting worse. I could smell Joe's blood pumping through his veins. I dug my nails into my palms to focus. The original Wendigo, the one controlling the others, will appear when the moon is highest tomorrow night, Joe continued. That's our only chance. But Michael, he looked at me with sad eyes. The person who performs the ritual, they must be pure of heart, but touched by the Wendigo's curse. I understood what he meant. I was infected, but not fully turned. I could be the sacrifice. But Sarah was coming. My little girl was driving straight into this nightmare. Suddenly, a howl echoed across the valley. Not a wolf, not anything natural. Joe's dogs started barking frantically. They're coming, Joe whispered. They can smell your infected blood. Through the window, I saw 3 tall shadows moving through the trees toward the house. And in the distance, I heard a car engine. Joe grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back door. There's a storm cellar, he said quickly. We need to hide. Now. We barely made it outside when I heard Sarah's car pulling up in front. My heart stopped. No, not now. Dad? Sarah's voice called out. Uncle Joe? Your truck's here. Sarah, run! I tried to shout, but my voice came out wrong, raspy and animal-like. The hunger was getting stronger. The shadows in the trees moved faster now. I could see Tom's twisted shape leading them, his long claws gleaming in the moonlight. Joe pulled something from his pocket, a flare gun. Get to the cellar, he ordered. I'll get Sarah. I can't leave her. You're turning, Michael. You'll hurt her if you get too close. Go. He was right. I could feel it. The hunger trying to take over, making me want things I shouldn't want. Making me want to number. I wouldn't think about that. I stumbled toward the cellar as Joe ran to Sarah. Behind me, I heard her scream. Then the flare gun went off, lighting up the night with red fire. The cellar door was heavy, but I managed to pull it open. Inside, it smelled of earth and old wood. I practically fell down the stairs, my legs shaking badly now. Above me, I heard running footsteps. The cellar door opened again, and Sarah and Joe rushed in, slamming it shut behind them. Dad? Sarah's voice trembled. Dad? What's happening? What's wrong with those things outside? I stayed in the shadows, trying to hide what I was becoming. Sarah, you shouldn't have come. Your father's been infected, Joe explained quietly. But we have a chance to stop this. All of it. Something heavy landed on the cellar door above us, then another, and another. They were trying to break in. The ritual, I managed to say through clenched teeth. Tell her about the ritual. But before Joe could explain, we heard a new sound, a deep, rumbling roar that shook dirt loose from the cellar ceiling. It wasn't Tom or the others. This was something bigger, something older. The original Wendigo, Joe whispered. It's here early. The hunger in your blood called to it. Sarah moved closer to me, but I backed away. Don't, I warned her. Please, I can't. I can't trust myself. The cellar door began to crack. Joe pulled a trapdoor hidden under some old blankets. Quick, this tunnel leads to the old prayer cave. The ritual must be performed there. We crawled through the narrow tunnel as the cellar door above finally broke. The sound of those things entering echoed behind us. Sarah was crying softly, but trying to be brave. Every few seconds, my body would shake with hunger pains, making it hard to crawl. Almost there, Joe whispered. The cave is just ahead. The tunnel opened into a small cave. Old drawings covered the walls, pictures of tall, twisted creatures and people making sacrifices. The air felt different here, heavy with something ancient. Joe quickly lit some torches while explaining the ritual. The Wendigo's power is strongest at midnight. That's when we must act. Michael, he looked at me sadly. You know what needs to be done. Sarah grabbed my arm. No, there has to be another way. I could barely focus on her words. The hunger was screaming inside me now. My fingers were starting to stretch into claws. Sarah, listen to me. If we don't stop this thing, everyone in the region will die. I'm already changing. At least let me die saving you. A horrible screech filled the cave. They had found the tunnel. We have no time, Joe said, drawing a circle with strange symbols. Michael, stand in the center. Sarah, you must stay back. I stumbled into the circle. My skin felt like it was being stretched. Above us, through a crack in the cave ceiling, I could see the moon nearly at its highest point. That's when the original Wendigo arrived. It was enormous, at least 15 feet tall, made of ice and bones and darkness. Its antlers scraped the cave ceiling, and its eyes were like looking into an endless pit of hunger. Tom, Lisa, and Mark crawled in behind it, more animal than human now. They surrounded us, but didn't attack. They were waiting for their master's command. The Wendigo spoke, its voice like breaking ice. The hunger must feed. I felt something inside me responding to its call, trying to pull me out of the circle. Joe started chanting in his native language, his voice growing stronger. Sarah screamed, "Dad, your face!" I could feel my jaw stretching, teeth sharpening. The change was almost complete. In a few moments, I wouldn't be her father anymore. I'd be one of them. It was time. With the last bit of humanity I had left, I looked at Sarah. "I love you, sweetheart. Run. Don't look back." Joe's chanting grew louder. The symbols around me began to glow with a blue light. The Wendigo roared, shaking the whole cave. "Now, Michigan Chale," Joe shouted. "The knife! Use it!" He had given me a bone knife earlier, carved with special markings. My hands were shaking as I held it. The hunger was almost unbearable now. Sarah tried to run to me, but Joe held her back. "Dad, please, don't do this." The Wendigo stepped closer, its massive form blocking the moonlight. "Join us," it commanded. The other creatures, the things that used to be my fellow rangers, crept forward, their claws scraping the stone floor. With every bit of strength I had left, I raised the knife. "You want hunger?" I growled at the Wendigo. "Then hunger for this." I plunged the knife into my heart. The cave exploded with blue light. The Wendigo screamed, not in triumph, but in rage. I felt its power trying to take me, but something else was happening. The ritual was working. Joe's voice reached a crescendo. The symbols on the ground turned from blue to bright white. I could feel the Wendigo being pulled away like it was being trapped in ice. "No," it roared. "The hunger cannot be bound." But it was too late. Ice began forming around its massive body. The other creatures screamed as they too began to freeze. Tom, Lisa, Mark, I saw their faces one last time, and for just a moment, they looked human again. Maybe they were finally finding peace. My body was growing cold, but the hunger was fading. Through blurring vision, I saw Sarah crying in Joe's arms. At least she was safe. At least it was over. The Wendigo gave one final, earth-shaking roar before the ice completely covered it. Then everything went quiet. I felt myself falling, but I never hit the ground. The last thing I heard was Sarah's voice. "Dad. Dad, no." Then darkness took me. Sarah told me later what happened after I fell. The cave filled with a blinding white light, and when it faded, the Wendigo and its followers were gone, frozen into the cave walls like ancient ice sculptures. They found my body, but it wasn't twisted or changed anymore. The hunger curse had died with the Wendigo. I looked peaceful, she said, like I was just sleeping. The authorities tried to cover it up, of course. They demolished the ranger station and declared the area restricted. They said it was because of dangerous weather conditions. But the locals know better. Sarah survived, though the frost took 2 of her fingers that night. She lives with Joe now, helping him maintain the rituals that keep the Wendigo bound. Every winter, on the coldest night, they go to the cave and renew the protective symbols, just in case. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, people say they can still hear strange sounds from that part of the forest. and every 50 years, the winters get colder than they should. That's when the Ojibwe gather in greater numbers, strengthening the bindings that hold the hunger spirit. Sarah wrote down my story, the real story, in Joe's tribal records. She wants people to know what really happened and what it cost to keep them safe. The rangers who work that area now follow strict rules. No one patrols alone. Everyone carries protective herbs. And if the temperature drops too low for too long, they evacuate immediately. But most importantly, they listen when the locals warn them about ancient spirits. Because sometimes, the old stories aren't just stories. Last week, Sarah visited my grave. She said she felt something watching her from the trees, but it wasn't threatening. She thinks it was me, still keeping watch, still protecting her. I hope she's right, because even though the Wendigo is bound, the hunger never truly dies. It waits, patient and eternal, for another 50 years to pass. And when that time comes, someone else will have to make the choice I made. But for now, the forests are quiet. The winters are normal. And my sacrifice keeps the hunger sleeping in its prison of ice. Remember my story. And if you ever find yourself in the Boundary Waters during a winter that's too cold, too long, don't ignore the warnings. Some hungers are better left unfed. My name is Harrison Wells, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Forest for the past 12 years. I never thought I'd have to write this down, but people need to know what happened here. What's still happening here. I guess I should tell you a bit about myself first. I'm 38, spent most of my life tracking and studying wildlife. My dad taught me everything about the forest when I was just a kid, how to read animal tracks, understand weather patterns, and survive in the wilderness. Those skills made me pretty good at my job, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered last summer. I live in a small cabin near the forest edge with my wife Sarah. Well, I used to live with her, but I'll get to that part later. We were happy here, just the two of us, surrounded by tall pine trees and the sounds of nature. Sarah loved taking photographs of the wildlife, and I loved watching her get excited about every deer or eagle she spotted. Everything was normal until that morning in early June. I was doing my usual patrol when I got a strange call from one of our hikers. They were talking so fast, scared about something they saw in the trees. I thought maybe they'd spotted a bear or a mountain lion. That's usually what gets people worked up out here. But what they described made no sense at all. They said they saw faces in the trees. Not carved faces like you might see in a park, but real human faces, pushing through the bark like someone trying to break free from behind it. I remember laughing it off at first. People see all sorts of weird things when they're tired or scared in the forest. But then more reports started coming in. Different hikers, different parts of the forest, all describing the same thing. That's when I decided to check it out myself. I wish I hadn't. I really wish I hadn't. Because what I found that day changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. And now, looking back, I realize that was just the beginning of our nightmare. Let me tell you exactly what happened, but I have to warn you, after hearing this story, you'll never look at forests the same way again. And whatever you do, if you ever visit Olympic National Forest, never, ever stare at the trees for too long, because sometimes they stare back. I still remember that first investigation like it happened yesterday. The morning was unusually quiet. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, just silence. I followed the hiking trail where people reported seeing those faces, my flashlight beam cutting through the morning fog. After about 2 miles in, I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. On a huge old pine tree, about eye level, the bark was different. It was moving, like something was pushing against it from inside. As I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. There it was, a human face, pressed into the bark like a mask. But it looked alive. The face was of a young woman, her eyes closed as if she was sleeping. The weird thing was, The bark formed her features perfectly, her nose, her lips, even her eyelashes. I reached out to touch its stupid move, I know now, and the bark felt warm. That's not normal. Bark shouldn't be warm. I took photos and called my colleague Mike over the radio. Mike, you need to see this. I'm at marker 23 on Pine Trail. What's up, Harrison? He asked. Just come here. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. While waiting for Mike, I noticed something else strange. The trees around me seemed different. I've walked these trails thousands of times, but something felt off. It was like the spaces between the trees had changed, like they had moved closer together. That's when I remembered something. Last week, an environmental scientist, Dr. Emily Chen, had gone missing in this same area. She was studying tree diseases or something. Her backpack was found, but she just vanished. Now I was standing here, looking at faces in trees, and wondering if these two things were connected. Mike arrived about 20 minutes later. When he saw the face, he turned pale. This isn't possible, he kept saying. But it was there, right in front of us. Then we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams, a soft whisper, like someone trying to talk through layers of cloth. It seemed to come from the trees themselves. Mike heard it too. I could tell by the way his body froze. Harrison, he said slowly, we need to call someone about this. This isn't normal forest ranger stuff. He was right. But who do you call when trees start growing faces? Who would even believe us? That's when I remembered old Joseph, a Native American elder who lived near the forest. If anyone knew anything about strange things in these woods, it would be him. Little did I know, his stories would make me wish these faces were the worst of our problems. The sun was setting as we left that spot, but I swear, just before we turned away, I saw that face in the tree twitch, like it was trying to open its eyes. That evening, I drove to old Joseph's house on the edge of the reservation. He lived in a small wooden cabin, and I could see smoke coming from his chimney as I pulled up. I'd known him for years. He often helped us understand the old stories about the forest. When I told him what we'd found, he didn't look surprised. Instead, he just got really quiet and stared into his fireplace for a long time. Finally, he spoke. The elders warned us about this, he said softly. There are stories, very old stories, about the forest being alive in a different way. Not just trees and animals, but something hungry. He told me about an ancient spirit that lived in the forest. According to the stories, it would wake up every few hundred years, needing to feed. But it didn't want food like we do. It wanted souls. It would trap people inside the trees, keeping them alive somehow, feeding off their memories and feelings. But why now? I asked. Why is it happening again? Old Joseph looked at me with worried eyes. The solar eclipse, he said. It's coming in 3 weeks. The spirit is strongest during the eclipse. That's when it fully wakes up. As he talked, I remembered Dr. Chen's backpack we'd found. I pulled out her journal from my bag. I'd grabbed it from the office before coming here. As we flipped through it, my hands started shaking. The last few entries were disturbing. She wrote about trees moving when she wasn't looking, about hearing voices calling her name. The final entry just said, "They're not trees. Oh God, they're not trees at all." Just then, my phone rang. It was Mike, and he sounded terrified. "Harrison, you need to come back. Now," he said. I went back to that tree with the face. "Harrison, it's gone. The face is gone. But I found something worse. There's an animal, a deer. It's turned inside out, but it's still alive, still moving. Please hurry." I looked at old Joseph. He just nodded. "It's beginning," he said. "The forest is waking up. You need to find the heart tree before the eclipse. It's the only way to stop this." "The heart tree?" I asked. "The biggest tree in the ancient grove, the one where it all started." "But Harrison," he grabbed my arm, "be careful. The forest, it knows how to use your memories against you. It knows how to hurt you the most." As I drove back to the forest, the sun had completely set. Through my car window, I could see the trees swaying in the darkness. There was no wind that night. No wind at all. I raced back to meet Mike at the ranger station. The night was pitch black, and my headlights caught the trees along the road. They seemed to bend away from the light, like they were trying to hide. Mike was waiting outside, his face as white as a sheet. Without saying a word, he led me to his truck and pulled out a flashlight. "Follow me," he whispered. "But Harrison, prepare yourself. This isn't normal." We walked about half a mile into the forest. The silence was different now, heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. Then I saw it. The deer was lying in a small clearing, and, God, I still have trouble describing it. Its skin was turned inside out, but somehow it was breathing. Its eyes looked at us, begging for help. "We should put it out of its misery," Mike said quietly. But when we got closer, the deer just disappeared. Like it melted into the ground, leaving nothing behind. Not even footprints. That's when we heard the whispers again. But this time, they were clearer. They were saying names. Our names. "We need help," I said. "Professional help." I called the Forest Service headquarters and convinced them to send a special team. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to get them here. The next morning, Dr. Sarah Martinez and her team arrived. They brought all sorts of equipment, cameras, sensors, everything. But the weird thing was, none of their equipment worked properly near the trees. Batteries would die instantly. Cameras would show only static. We split into teams to search the forest. I was with Dr. Martinez when we found something that made my blood run cold. The ground beneath our feet was wrong. When we shone our flashlights down, we could see faces pressed up against the soil, like people trying to break through ice. They covered the entire forest floor. "Look at the patterns," Dr. Martinez said, her voice shaking. "These faces, they're not random. They're connected somehow, like roots." Then we heard Mike scream. We ran toward his voice, but the forest seemed to shift around us. Paths that should have been straight now twisted in impossible ways. Trees that weren't there before blocked our path. It was like the forest was trying to stop us from reaching him. When we finally found Mike's location, he was just standing there, staring at a tree. But this tree was different. It was moving, its bark rippling like water. And as we watched, horrified, a wooden hand started reaching out from inside it. "Mike," I shouted, "get away from there." But he didn't move. He just kept staring and whispered something that made my heart stop. "Harrison, it looks just like my daughter. My Katie, who died last year, she's in there." Everything happened so fast after that. I ran toward Mike, but it was like running through syrup. Everything felt slow and heavy. The wooden hand was reaching for him, and Mike, he just stood there, tears running down his face. "Katie," he whispered again, reaching back toward the hand. "It's not her!" I screamed. "Mike, it's tricking you!" But it was too late. The moment Mike's fingers touched the wooden hand, the tree seemed to come alive. The bark split open like a mouth, and before I could reach him, it pulled him in. Just pulled him right into the tree. His scream cut off suddenly, and then silence. Dr. Martinez grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We can't help him now," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go, now." As we ran, I saw more trees starting to move. Their branches reached for us like fingers, and faces began appearing in their trunks, dozens of them. Some I recognized, hikers who had gone missing over the years. And then I saw Sarah. My wife's face formed in a nearby tree. Her eyes closed like she was sleeping. "Harrison," her voice called softly. "Harrison, please help me." I almost stopped. Almost. But I remembered old Joseph's warning about memories being used against us. "It's not real," I told myself, running faster. "It's not Sarah." We made it back to the ranger station, but 3 of our team members were missing. Dr. Martinez immediately started going through her readings and Dr. Chen's journal. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one of Dr. Chen's last entries. She found something in the ancient grove, something about a heart tree. I told her what old Joseph had said about the eclipse and the heart tree. She nodded slowly. "The eclipse is in 5 days," she said. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it before then." That night, none of us could sleep. The whispers had gotten louder, and we could hear them even inside the station. They were voices of people we knew, people we'd lost, calling us, begging us to join them. But the worst part? When I looked out the window at around midnight, I saw all the trees had turned to face the station, every single one, and in their bark, hundreds of faces watched us with hollow eyes. We knew we had to find the heart tree, but the forest wasn't going to make it easy, and we were running out of time. The next morning, we prepared for our search. There were only 5 of us left now: me, Dr. Martinez, and 3 Forest Service officers. We packed flares, ropes, and emergency supplies. Old Joseph had joined us too, saying he could help find the ancient grove. "The heart tree will be different," old Joseph explained. "Bigger than the others, and time won't feel right around it." He wasn't kidding about the time thing. As we walked deeper into the forest, our watches started going crazy. Mine said it was midnight, then noon, then yesterday. The forest felt different too, older somehow. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than cars. Then things got stranger. We'd walk for what felt like hours, but the sun wouldn't move in the sky. Or we'd take just a few steps and suddenly it would be dark. It was like the forest was playing with time itself. "Look," Officer Chen pointed at something ahead. Through the trees, we saw a clearing. In the middle stood the biggest tree I'd ever seen. Its trunk was as wide as a house, and it seemed to pulse with a faint light. But getting to it wasn't easy. The other trees kept moving, blocking our path. Their branches would swing down at us when we weren't looking. We had to stay close together, watching each other's backs. That's when we heard it, a sound like a giant heartbeat coming from the massive tree, and as we got closer, we could see why they called it the heart tree. Its entire trunk was covered in faces, hundreds of them, all moving, all whispering. Some were crying, some were screaming silently. "Harrison," a familiar voice called. I turned and saw Sarah again, her face forming in a nearby tree. But this time, something was different. Her eyes were open, and they were full of tears. "Harrison, please, it hurts." Dr. Martinez grabbed my arm. "The eclipse starts in an hour," she said. "Whatever we're going to do, we have to do it now." But as we approached the heart tree, the ground began to shake. The faces in the trunk all opened their eyes at once, and their whispers turned into a deafening scream. The forest was fully awake now, and it wasn't going to let us stop it. The sky started getting dark as the eclipse began. All around us, the trees were moving like they were dancing in a wild storm, but there wasn't any wind. The faces in the heart tree were screaming louder now, and I could see more people I knew: Mike, Dr. Chen, and other missing hikers. Old Joseph pulled out some ancient-looking papers from his bag. "We need to burn it," he said. "The heart tree must burn during the eclipse. It's the only way." But as we tried to get closer, something horrible happened. The bark of the heart tree split open like a door, and something stepped out. It looked like it was made of twisted wood and parts of people. Arms, legs, faces, all mixed together in a terrible way. And its eyes were glowing with a green light. "You can't stop this." It spoke, but not with one voice. It was like hundreds of voices talking together. The forest must feed. The forest must grow. 2 of the Forest Service officers tried to run. Bad idea. The trees behind them came alive, their branches shooting out like spears. I don't want to describe what happened next. Let's just say we never saw those officers again. Dr. Martinez was braver than any of us. While the creature was distracted, she started splashing gasoline around the base of the heart tree. But before she could finish, roots burst from the ground, wrapping around her legs. "Harrison!" she screamed, throwing me her lighter. "Finish it!" I caught the lighter just as Sarah appeared again. Not in a tree this time, but standing right in front of me. She looked completely real, just like the day she disappeared 6 months ago. "Harrison, please don't," she begged. "If you burn it, you'll kill all of us trapped inside. We can be together again. Just join us." My hands were shaking. The eclipse was almost complete. I had to choose, and I had to choose now. I looked at Sarah, or what looked like Sarah, one last time. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and flicked the lighter on. Time seemed to slow down as I threw it at the heart tree. The gasoline caught immediately. The fire spread faster than normal fire should, racing up the trunk of the heart tree. The creature made of wood and human parts let out a scream that shook the whole forest. The faces in the tree were screaming too, hundreds of them, all at once. "Help me!" Dr. Martinez yelled. I ran to her, pulling at the roots that held her legs. Old Joseph helped me, and together we freed her just as the flames reached higher. But the forest wasn't done fighting. Branches from every direction whipped at us like angry snakes. Trees were falling everywhere. The ground cracked open under our feet. It was chaos. "Run!" Old Joseph shouted. "Get to the edge of the ancient grove." We ran like we've never run before. Behind us, the heart tree was now completely on fire, and the creature was melting back into it, still screaming with all those voices. The Sarah thing disappeared like smoke in the wind. The eclipse reached its peak just then. Everything went dark except for the burning heart tree. And in that darkness, I heard Sarah's voice one last time. "Thank you for setting us free." We barely made it out. The whole ancient grove burned that day, but the fire wouldn't spread past its borders. It just burned in a perfect circle, like it knew exactly where to stop. When it was all over, nothing was left in that area but ash. No trees would grow there again. Dr. Martinez and Old Joseph survived with me, but we were the only ones. The missing people, including Sarah and Mike, were never found. But sometimes, even now, when I'm in other parts of the forest, I hear whispers in the trees. And occasionally, when I look at the bark of certain trees, I see faces starting to form. They fade away quickly, but I know what I saw. The Forest Service closed that area off. They said it was because of environmental damage. But we know the truth. Something is still out there in the Olympic National Forest. Something that waits and watches and remembers. And if you're ever hiking in these woods, and the trees seem to be watching you, or if you hear whispers that sound like someone you lost, run. Run as fast as you can. Because the forest still has eyes. It's been 2 years since that day in the forest. I still work as a ranger, but in a different area now. I couldn't stay near that place anymore. Dr. Martinez moved away too, last I heard. She was writing a book about what happened, but no one will publish it. They say it's too unbelievable. Old Joseph still lives near the forest. He keeps watch, he says. Sometimes he calls me when he notices things, like how the dead zone where the heart tree was is slowly getting bigger, inch by inch, year by year. I've tried to move on with my life, but some things you can't forget. Like yesterday, when I was checking trail markers, I found a fresh hiking boot next to a tree. Just one boot, like someone had disappeared while wearing it. And there, in the bark above it, was the beginning of a face starting to form. I called it in, of course. But by the time help arrived, both the boot and the face were gone. Just gone, like they were never there. The strangest thing, though, every now and then when I'm alone in the woods, I'll find a single photograph on the ground. They're always photos that Sarah took, pictures I know were in our house when she disappeared. They're always fresh, like they were just dropped there moments ago. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, my phone rings. When I answer, there's no voice, just the sound of leaves rustling and what might be whispers in the background. The calls always come from Sarah's old number. I keep telling myself I should quit this job, move to a city somewhere, but I can't. Because I know someone needs to be here to warn others, to tell them the truth about these woods. So if you're reading this, remember, the forest is alive in ways we don't understand. And if you ever hear your name being whispered by the trees, or or see a face starting to form in the bark, don't stop to look. Don't stop to listen. Just run. Because the forest never forgets. And it's still hungry. My name is Eleanor Wright, and I wish I never took that job at Mammoth Cave National Park. What I saw there, what I experienced, it changed me forever. I used to be a normal anthropologist, spending my days studying ancient cultures and human behavior. But now, at 35, I'm haunted by shadows that shouldn't exist and memories that keep me awake at night. Let me tell you how it all began. I arrived at Mammoth Cave last summer, excited about my new job as a park ranger. The cave system was massive, the longest in the world, they said. I thought I knew everything about it from my studies, but I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The local people, especially the older ones, always warned us about those who dwell below. I remember Mrs. Thompson, an 80-year-old who lived nearby, grabbing my arm one day and telling me, "Child, some places aren't meant for us to explore. Some things should stay buried." I smiled politely then, thinking it was just another local legend. How I wish I had listened to her. My first few weeks were normal, giving tours, checking safety equipment, and learning the main cave routes. But then the disappearances started. First, it was a young college student named Mike. He went in with his friends but never came out. His friends said he was right behind them, then suddenly, gone. The police searched for days but found nothing. Then came the others. A middle-aged couple on their anniversary trip. A professional photographer. 2 local teenagers. A cave diving expert. 7 people in just 3 months. Each case was the same. People would vanish without a trace, leaving behind their belongings, as if they had simply melted into the darkness. I started digging into the park's history, looking for similar cases. That's when I found the cave paintings. Hidden in a less visited section, they showed something that made my blood run cold. Tall, stick-like figures, carrying away what looked like human bodies. The native people had been warning us for centuries, but we never listened. But the real horror hadn't even started yet. One morning, I arrived to find everyone in panic. The underground lake, a stable feature of the cave for thousands of years, had completely drained overnight. Just gone. No explanation. No warning. Scientists were baffled. But deep down, I felt something was waking up. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. I never imagined that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change not only my life, but everything I thought I knew about human history, and about what really lives in the dark places of our world. My investigation started simply enough. I talked to the families of the missing people, trying to find any connection between them. The strange thing was, they had nothing in common except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I remember sitting with Mike's mom in her kitchen. She kept touching his photo, tears in her eyes. "He was so careful," she said. "He always followed the safety rules. It just doesn't make sense." She was right. None of it made sense. I spent hours going through old police reports and park records. There were other disappearances over the years, but they were always explained away. People getting lost, accidents, or cave-ins. But something felt different this time. One evening, while checking the security cameras, I noticed something odd. Every time someone disappeared, the cameras would show static for exactly 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes. Never more, never less. When I told my boss, he said it was probably just electrical problems from being underground. But how could electrical problems be so precise? Then came the weird stuff with our equipment. Flashlights would die even with new batteries. Radios would pick up strange sounds. Not static, but something that sounded almost like whispers. Our compasses would spin in circles, and phone GPS would show us being in completely wrong locations. I started talking to the old-timers who lived nearby. They shared stories passed down through generations. Stories about people hearing children's laughter deep in the caves where no children should be. About shadows that moved against the light. About feelings of being watched. One story stuck with me. An old man named Bill told me about his grandfather, who was a cave guide in the 1920s. One day, his grandfather saw footprints on the cave ceiling. Not drawings of footprints, actual footprints, as if someone had walked up there. When he brought others to see, the prints were gone. I was writing all this in my journal late one night when the earthquake hit. It wasn't a big one, just enough to rattle the windows. But what it did to the cave system was incredible. The next morning, we found a new passage had opened up. Standing at the entrance of that dark opening, I felt something I'd never felt before in all my years of cave exploration. Fear. Pure, instinctive fear. Like my body knew something my mind didn't yet understand. I should have listened to that fear. I should have walked away right then. But I didn't. Instead, I gathered my equipment and prepared to check out the new passage. After all, I was a scientist. I needed answers. But some answers come at a terrible price, and what I found in that passage would haunt me for the rest of my life. I still remember every detail of that day when we entered the new passage. I wasn't alone, thank goodness for that. With me were Joseph, my fellow ranger, and 2 cave experts, Tom and Sarah. We had all our usual gear: helmets, lights, ropes, and emergency supplies. The passage was different from any I'd seen before. Most cave walls are rough, but these were smooth, almost like they'd been polished. Our flashlight beams showed something else strange: perfectly straight lines cut into the rock, like someone had carved them. But who? And why? "Eleanor, look at this," Sarah called out, her voice shaking a bit. She was pointing at marks on the wall. At first, I thought they were more carved lines. But no, they were scratches. Long, deep scratches that ran from floor to ceiling. Something had made those marks, something with claws. We kept going deeper, following the passage as it went down, down, down. The air got colder, and our breath came out in white puffs. After about an hour, Tom's equipment showed we were almost 1,000 feet below the surface. That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a cave. Something between a whimper and a cry. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely human. We found him huddled in a small side chamber, Mark Wilson, one of the missing spelunkers. He was alive, but something was terribly wrong. He was rocking back and forth, his hands covering his face. "Mark," I said softly, touching his shoulder. "We're here to help." When he looked up, we all gasped. Where his eyes should have been, there were only empty, dark sockets. "They take your eyes," he whispered. "They take your eyes so you can't see them coming." Before we could ask who they were, our lights started flickering. All of them. At the same time, then we saw it, a shadow moving on the ceiling. Not cast by any of us. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin like a stretched-out human. And it was walking upside down, like gravity didn't matter. "Run!" Mark screamed. "Run!" We grabbed Mark and started running back the way we came. But in the chaos, our lights kept flickering, and the shadows. The shadows seemed to be everywhere. That's when I saw one of them clearly for the first time. 9 feet tall, skin so pale it was almost white, and where its eyes should have been, nothing. Just smooth, blank skin. The worst part? It smiled at me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Joseph grabbed my arm and pulled me along. Behind us, we could hear something moving. Not footsteps exactly, more like scratching. We ran until our lungs burned, somehow finding our way back to the main cave. Mark was still with us, gripping my hand so tight it hurt. Back at the surface, nobody believed our story. They said Mark must have hurt himself in an accident. They said we were confused, or scared, or making things up. But I knew what I saw, and I knew we had to go back, because there were still 5 people missing down there. And whatever those things were, they were hunting. It took 3 days to put together a rescue team. Nobody wanted to go back down there, but we had to. People's lives were at stake. Our team had 6 people: me, Joseph, 2 professional cave rescuers named Mike and Dave, a local guide named Pete, and Dr. Harris, who insisted on coming to document everything. We were better prepared this time. More lights, better radios, cameras, and even some military-grade night vision gear. But somehow, I knew deep down that no amount of equipment would be enough against what waited below. The descent felt different this time. Every shadow made us jump. Every echo made us freeze. We followed our previous route, marking our path with bright tape. The scratch marks on the walls seemed deeper now, fresher. "Look at this," Dr. Harris said, pointing his camera at the floor. There were more footprints, but these were weird. Some on the floor, some on the walls, some on the ceiling. Like whatever made them didn't care which way was up. Then Pete found something that made my stomach turn. A camera. It belonged to one of the missing people, a photographer named Lisa. The last photo on it showed something tall and white standing in a dark corner, its head turned at an impossible angle. That's when our radios started picking up voices. Not our team's voices, children's voices, laughing and singing, but we were 1,000 feet underground. There couldn't be any children here. "Guys," Mike whispered, "I think we're being watched." He was right. In the beam of our lights, we could see them, dozens of pale, eyeless faces, peeking from cracks in the walls, hiding behind rocks, always just at the edge of our vision. They were playing with us. Dave was the first to go. One minute he was right behind us, the next, gone. Just gone. We heard his scream echo through the caves, then silence. Dr. Harris panicked and ran. We tried to stop him, but he disappeared into a side tunnel. We found his camera 10 minutes later, still recording. The footage showed him running, then stopping suddenly as something tall and white stepped out of the wall, right through the solid rock, and reached for him. One by one, they picked us off. Mike fell into a hole that wasn't there a second before. Pete just disappeared between one blink and the next. Their screams echoed through the caves for what felt like hours. Soon it was just me and Joseph. We found ourselves in what looked like an underground city. Ancient buildings carved into the rock, strange symbols everywhere. And worse, hundreds of those creatures, moving around like spiders, crawling on every surface. "Eleanor," Joseph said, grabbing my shoulders, "someone has to warn everyone. These things, they're spreading. I've seen their tunnels. They're digging new ones, heading toward other cave systems." I knew what he was going to do before he said it. "No, Joseph, please." "Run," he said, pulling out a flare. "I'll hold them off. Run, and don't look back." I still remember Joseph's last words before he lit that flare. The bright red light filled the cave, and I ran. Behind me, I heard his shouts, followed by those horrible screeching sounds that the creatures made. I ran until my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. They chased me through the tunnels. I could hear them in the walls, above me, below me. Their long white fingers would reach out from cracks I swore weren't there before. One of them grabbed my jacket. I slipped out of it and kept running. My last flashlight died. I was in complete darkness, running my hand along the wall, praying I was going the right way. That's when I felt it, a slight breeze. Fresh air. I followed it, stumbling, falling, crawling. Something grabbed my ankle. I kicked hard and felt my boot connect with something cold and smooth. There was that awful screech again right behind me. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees. Then I saw it, a tiny dot of daylight ahead. I've never run so fast in my life. Just as I reached the cave entrance, I felt those long fingers brush against my back one last time. I burst out into the sunlight and collapsed. The rescue team found me there, crying and shaking. But when they went back to look for the others, they couldn't find the passage we'd used. It was just gone, like it had never existed. The next morning, I woke up in the hospital and couldn't see anything. The doctors said it was temporary blindness, maybe from shock. For 3 months, my world was dark. During that time, I could hear them trying to cover it all up. "Cave in," they said. "Tragic accident." They even brought in government people who asked me to sign papers to keep quiet. But the worst part? When my sight finally came back, things were different. I see them now. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. Tall, thin shapes in the corner of my eye. Sometimes at night, I hear scratching in my walls. Last week, I got a letter from a cave explorer in France. He wrote about finding strange scratch marks in a deep cave, about footprints on the ceiling, about his friends going missing. They're spreading just like Joseph warned, moving through the deep places under our feet, reaching out to new caves, new hunting grounds, and nobody believes me when I try to warn them. So I wrote it all down, every detail, in my journal. Maybe someone will find it and understand the truth that we're not alone down here, that something ancient and hungry lives in the dark. Something that's been waiting, watching, and now it's awake. Sometimes at night, when I hear those scratches in my walls getting louder, I wonder, did I really escape, or did they let me go? Let me go to spread their story, to make others curious enough to go looking for them? Because that's what they want. They want us to come down there, into their dark world. They're always hungry, always watching, always waiting. And if you ever find yourself in a cave and your flashlight starts to flicker, remember my story. Remember what lives in the dark. And whatever you do, don't look up. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I'm about to tell you something that happened to me back in 1963. Something that still gives me nightmares even today. I was 42 then, working as a park ranger at Mount Baker Wilderness in Washington. After coming back from Vietnam, I thought this quiet job in the mountains would help me find peace. Boy, was I wrong. Let me tell you, nothing from my time in the war could have prepared me for what I encountered that winter. Even now, when the temperature drops and snow starts falling, I can feel my hands shaking and that familiar chill running down my spine. Before I get into the really scary stuff, you should know that I wasn't always the jumpy person I am today. After Vietnam, sure, I had my demons. The loud noises would startle me, and sometimes I'd wake up in cold sweats. But I chose to become a ranger because I loved nature. The mountains, trees, and wildlife, they were my escape. The peace and quiet helped me forget about the war. The Native Americans who lived in these parts had always warned us about something they called the long winter. At first, I thought it was just another folktale, you know, like the stories my grandma used to tell me when I was little. Old Joe Running Bear, one of the tribal elders, would often visit our ranger station. He'd sit there, sipping his coffee, telling us how his people believed that during particularly harsh winters, ancient creatures would wake up from their long sleep. I remember clearly how it all started. That week, 3 hikers had gone missing, just vanished into thin air. All we found were some blood trails that made no sense. They would start in one place and suddenly stop, as if whatever made them had just disappeared into thin air. I'd seen mountain lion attacks and bear incidents before, but this was different. Really different. Then there were these old rock drawings we found, petroglyphs, the scientists call them. They showed these weird wolf-like creatures hunting humans. I didn't think much of them at the time. I mean, ancient people drew all sorts of things, right? But then came that night, the 15th of February, 1963. The temperature had dropped to negative 20°4 F, which was unusually cold even for Mount Baker. The snow was falling so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And the northern lights, I'll never forget those lights. Instead of their usual green color, they were blood red, painting the snow-covered mountains in an eerie crimson glow. I was doing my regular patrol that night, though everything felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, no bird sounds, no small animals scurrying about, nothing. Just the howling wind and this feeling in my gut that something terrible was about to happen. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. It was around midnight when I found something that made my blood run cold. One of our park service horses, a strong brown stallion named Buck, was lying in the snow. At first, I thought he had just fallen, but when I got closer with my flashlight, I couldn't believe my eyes. Poor Buck was frozen solid, like he'd been turned into an ice statue. Half of him was, well, let's just say something had been eating him. But here's the weird part. The bite marks were huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these mountains. That's when I noticed the tracks in the snow. They looked like wolf prints, but something was very wrong about them. First off, they were massive, bigger than my hand. And second, they showed whatever made them was walking on two legs, like a person. I'd tracked all kinds of animals in my years as a ranger, but I'd never seen anything like this. I reached for my radio to call it in. That's when I heard it. Children's voices coming through the static. They were crying, begging for help. My heart started racing, because I knew for a fact there weren't any children registered in the park. It was the middle of winter, and the area had been closed to visitors because of the severe weather. Hello? This is Ranger Blackwood. Who's there? I called into my radio. Only static answered me, then more crying, getting fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely. I was trying to make sense of what was happening when I heard someone stumbling through the snow behind me. I turned around, my flashlight beam catching a woman with wild eyes and frost-covered hair. She collapsed right in front of me. The ice wolves. She kept mumbling as I wrapped her in my emergency blanket. They breathe ice. They control the storm. They're hunting us. Her name was Amy Wilson. She was shaking so bad her teeth were chattering, but it wasn't just from the cold. Pure terror filled her eyes as she grabbed my arm. "You have to believe me," she whispered. "They're not normal wolves. They're huge, with eyes that glow blue like frozen stars. They got the others." I was about to tell her she was just confused from hypothermia when I heard it, a howl that seemed to shake the very mountains. But this wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, almost like it had words in it. Then another howl answered, and another. Amy started crying. "They're coming," she whimpered. I helped her up, and we started moving as fast as we could toward my ranger station. That's when I saw them through the swirling snow, massive shapes, at least 8 feet tall, moving on two legs. Their eyes glowed that terrible blue Amy had described, and their breath came out like Arctic wind. I counted 8 of them, forming a circle around us, getting closer and closer. I half carried, half dragged Amy through the deep snow, trying to reach the ranger station. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the howling wind. The wolves were following us. I could hear their heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, but every time I looked back, they seemed to disappear into the blizzard like ghosts. Finally, we made it to the station. My partner Marcus was there, warming his hands by the fireplace. The moment he saw Amy's condition and the look on my face, he knew something was terribly wrong. "Tom, what in heaven's name is going on out there?" Marcus asked, helping me get Amy to the couch. Before I could answer, a deep growl echoed through the walls. It was so powerful that the windows rattled. Amy started crying again, curling up into a ball. "They found us," she whispered. That's when we heard it, a voice in our heads, clear as day. It wasn't like normal talking. It felt cold, like icicles forming in my mind. "Give us the woman," the voice demanded. "She has seen too much. Give her to us and you may live." Marcus looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you?" "Yeah, I heard it too." I nodded, grabbing my rifle even though deep down I knew regular bullets wouldn't do much good. The wolves started circling our station. Through the frosted windows, we could see their massive shadows moving past. Their glowing blue eyes peered in at us, and wherever their breath touched the glass, ice crystals formed instantly. "We need to get to the basement," Marcus said suddenly. "Last week, that old Native American, Joe Running Bear, he left something down there. Said we might need it someday." But before we could move, there was a tremendous crash. One of the wolves had broken through the back door. The freezing wind howled into the station. and with it came the smell of wet fur and ancient ice. Marcus pushed me toward the basement door. "Get down there. I'll hold them off." "Marcus, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. As I pushed Amy toward the basement stairs, I saw one of the wolves grab Marcus. Its breath hit him, and I watched in horror as ice started forming on his clothes. The last thing I heard before slamming the basement door was Marcus screaming. In the basement, Amy and I fumbled in the dark until I found the old emergency lantern. As its light flickered on, I saw what Marcus had been talking about. There in the corner was an old wooden chest covered in strange carvings. Above us, we could hear the wolves tearing the station apart, looking for us. With shaking hands, I opened the chest. Inside were weapons I'd never seen before. Arrows with red glowing tips and a bow that seemed to radiate warmth. There was a note from Joe Running Bear. "These are the fire arrows of our ancestors. When the ice wolves return, only fire can defeat them. The weapons are blessed with ancient magic. Use them wisely." Any other time, I would have thought this was crazy talk. But after what I'd just seen, I wasn't questioning anything anymore. "Thomas," Amy whispered urgently, "listen." The basement had gone quiet. Too quiet. Then we heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. The temperature dropped so low I could see our breath. "I can smell your fear," the alpha wolf's voice echoed in our minds. "Your friend Marcus is still alive, for now. Come up, and perhaps we can make a deal." My hands tightened around the bow. I looked at Amy and whispered, "When I say run, head for the back exit. Don't stop, no matter what you hear." I knocked one of the glowing arrows. The moment I touched it, I felt warmth spread through my frozen fingers. The footsteps got closer. Suddenly, the basement door burst open. The alpha wolf stood there, massive, white as death, with those terrible blue eyes. But this time, I was ready. I let the arrow fly. The moment it hit the wolf, flames erupted from the wound. The creature let out a howl of pain and rage that shook dust from the ceiling. "Run!" I shouted to Amy. As she sprinted for the back exit, I grabbed more arrows. The alpha wolf was thrashing around, trying to put out the flames. Its pack members were rushing down the stairs, but they were cautious now, seeing their leader wounded. I had 6 arrows left, 8 wolves to deal with. And somewhere upstairs, Marcus needed my help. I took a deep breath and raised the bow again. What followed was the most intense fight of my life. Each arrow I shot burst into flames when it hit a wolf, the basement filled with their howls of pain and the smell of burning fur. 2 wolves went down, then 3, then 4. But I knew I was running out of arrows. The alpha wolf, still burning, lunged at me. I rolled away, but its claws caught my leg. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt, not just sharp, but freezing cold, like being stabbed with icicles. "You will suffer for this, human," it snarled in my mind. "The cold will never leave your bones." I had 2 arrows left when I heard Marcus's weak voice from upstairs. "Tom, help." I shot another arrow at the wolves, blocking the stairs, and ran up, limping badly. I found Marcus near the fireplace, half frozen but alive. His skin was blue, and ice crystals covered his clothes. "The others," he whispered. "I saw what they really are. They're not just wolves. They're something ancient. Something that should have stayed asleep." Before he could say more, the alpha wolf burst through the floor. It was badly burned, but still moving. Behind it, the remaining wolves emerged from the basement. With my last arrow, I aimed straight at the alpha's heart. As it hit, the creature burst into blue and orange flames. But as it died, its eyes locked with mine. "The curse is done," it growled in my head. "Every winter you'll feel us. Every cold night you'll remember. The ice in your blood will never melt." The remaining wolves howled one last time and disappeared into the storm, leaving their burning leader behind. As the alpha wolf's body turned to ice and melted away, Marcus took his last breath in my arms. The rescue team found Amy and me the next morning. The bodies of the wolves were gone, leaving only burnt marks in the snow. Nobody believed our story, of course. They blamed everything on a regular wolf pack and the extreme cold. But the alpha wolf kept its promise. Ever since that night, I can't stand the cold. Every winter, my leg aches where its claws got me. And when the snow falls and the wind howls, I swear I can still hear them, those terrible howls from Devil's Peak. They never found the missing hikers. Sometimes, on very cold nights, people still report hearing children crying in the wilderness. And me? I left my job as a ranger, moved south where it's warm. But no matter how far I go, every winter I remember. Because the ice wolves are still out there, waiting for another long winter to wake them from their sleep.